Case 1. Diane Downs. Date of crime: May 19th, 1983. Location: Springfield, Oregon. The night was warm in Springfield, Oregon. It was the kind of spring evening when families took drives through the countryside, when children fell asleep in back seats listening to the radio, dreaming innocent dreams. But on Old Mohawk Road that night, something evil was unfolding. At 10:48 in the evening, a red Nissan sports car screeched into the emergency bay at Willamette Hospital. A young woman burst from the driver's seat, her voice cutting through the quiet night like a knife. "Someone killed my kids. Somebody just shot my kids." Inside the vehicle, hospital staff discovered a scene from a nightmare. 3 children lay in the back seat, covered in blood. 7-year-old Cheryl Lynn Downs was already gone, her small body still. 8-year-old Christy and was barely clinging to life, a bullet having caused massive blood loss that would result in a stroke. 3-year-old Danny had been shot through the spine. He would never walk again. The mother, 27-year-old Diane Downs, had only a minor gunshot wound to her left forearm. Detective Doug Welch of the Lane County Sheriff's Department arrived at the hospital within minutes. What he encountered would become his first homicide investigation, and it would haunt him for the rest of his career. Diane Downs told a chilling story. She claimed that around 9:30 in the evening, she had been driving on the isolated Old Mohawk Road when a strange man flagged her down. He was shaggy-haired, she said, unkempt, dangerous-looking. When she slowed her vehicle, he had approached her window and demanded her car keys. When she refused, he pulled out a gun and opened fire, shooting all 3 of her children and wounding her before fleeing into the darkness. It was a terrifying tale, but almost immediately, investigators noticed something wrong. Something terribly, fundamentally wrong. Diane Downs showed no emotion. While her daughter lay dead and her other 2 children fought for survival, she appeared calm, almost detached. She chatted casually with hospital staff. She seemed more concerned about calling her new boyfriend than about the welfare of her children. When Detective Welch interviewed her, he found her behavior bizarre and unsettling. The crime scene told a different story than the one Diane was selling. Old Mohawk Road was deserted that night. No witnesses had seen a shaggy-haired man. No other vehicles had been spotted in the area. The trajectory of the bullets didn't match her story. The physical evidence suggested the shots had been fired from inside the vehicle, not from someone standing at the driver's window. And then there was the matter of time. Diane claimed the shooting happened around 9:30, but she didn't arrive at the hospital until nearly 10:50. Old Mohawk Road was only 7 miles from the hospital. Even driving slowly, the journey should have taken no more than 10 to 15 minutes. Where had she been for over an hour while her children bled out in the back seat? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a motive that shocked the community. Diane Downs had been having an affair with a married man named Lou Lewiston. She was obsessed with him, consumed by the relationship. But Lou had made it clear he didn't want to be involved with a woman who had children. He wanted a childless relationship, free of parental responsibilities. For most mothers, such a statement would end the relationship immediately. Children come first. Always. But Diane Downs wasn't like most mothers. She saw her children as obstacles, impediments to the life she wanted with Lou. And so, on that warm May night, she decided to eliminate those obstacles permanently. The investigation intensified when Christy and began to recover from her injuries. The 8-year-old had suffered a stroke that affected her speech, but slowly, painstakingly, she began to communicate. And what she had to say would seal her mother's fate. Christy didn't remember a shaggy-haired stranger. She remembered her mother. She remembered Diane stopping the car, remembered her reaching for something, and then remembered the explosions of gunfire. In halting, difficult speech, Christy told prosecutors that her mother had shot them. Her own mother had tried to kill her and her siblings. The trial of Diane Downs began in May of 1984, exactly 1 year after the shootings. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Ballistics experts testified that the shots had been fired from inside the vehicle. Medical examiners questioned how Diane's wound could have been so superficial if she'd been shot by an assailant. Witnesses testified about her strange behavior at the hospital, how she'd shown more concern for her appearance than her children's survival. But the most powerful testimony came from Christy herself. The little girl, still recovering from her stroke, took the stand and identified her mother as the shooter. It was one of the most heartbreaking moments in Oregon legal history. a child testifying against the woman who gave her life and then tried to take it away. The defense argued that Diane was innocent, that she was being framed, that Christie's memories were confused because of her injuries. But the jury didn't believe it. After deliberating, they returned a guilty verdict on all counts: 1 count of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of criminal assault. Diane Downs was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. She would be eligible for parole after serving 25 years, but that possibility seemed remote. Oregon had seen evil before, but rarely had it worn the face of a mother. The story didn't end with her conviction. In July of 1987, Diane Downs escaped from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center. For 10 days, she was on the run, and the people of Oregon lived in fear. What would a woman who had killed her own child do to strangers? But she was recaptured, and this time, the security around her was tightened. Over the years, Diane Downs has maintained her innocence. She's appeared on television programs, given interviews, written letters proclaiming that she's the victim of a miscarriage of justice. She's blamed the system, blamed the investigators, blamed everyone but herself. She's never shown remorse. She's never acknowledged what she did. Christy and Danny Downs were adopted by the prosecutor who convicted their mother, Fred Hughey. They grew up in a loving home, far from the woman who tried to destroy them. Christy, despite her stroke, learned to speak clearly again. Danny learned to navigate life in a wheelchair. They survived, though they carry the scars, both physical and emotional, of that terrible night. In December of 2025, Diane Downs appeared before the parole board once again. It was her latest attempt to gain freedom, to walk out of prison and back into society. The board denied her parole, as they have done multiple times before. She remains behind bars, where she belongs. The case of Diane Downs is more than just a story of murder. It's a study in narcissism, in selfishness so profound that it overwhelmed every natural instinct of motherhood. Diane Downs didn't see her children as people. She saw them as problems to be solved. And when they stood between her and what she wanted, she solved them with bullets. Springfield, Oregon, has never forgotten that night. Old Mohawk Road still exists, still winds through the countryside, where families take drives on warm spring evenings. But those who remember May 19, 1983, will never drive that road without thinking of 3 children in a back seat, bleeding, dying, while their mother drove slowly to the hospital, taking her time, letting them suffer. Evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and fangs. Sometimes it arrives with a mother's face, a mother's voice, a mother's hands. And sometimes those hands hold a gun instead of offering an embrace. If you're finding this investigation compelling, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We bring you deep dives into the cases that changed communities forever. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Case 2, Amanda Stott-Smith. Date of crime, May 23, 2009. Location, Portland, Oregon. 26 years after Diane Downs shot her children on a country road, another Oregon mother would commit an act so heinous that it would join the darkest chapters in the state's criminal history. This time, the weapon wasn't a gun. It was a bridge. And the night was about to become a mother's final betrayal. The Selwood Bridge stretched across the Willamette River in Portland, Oregon, a steel and concrete span connecting the Selwood neighborhood to the west side of the city. On the night of May 23, 2009, that bridge became the site of unspeakable horror. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, 35-year-old Amanda Stott-Smith drove her 2 children, 7-year-old Trinity and 4-year-old Eldon, onto the bridge. The children were in the back seat, secured in their car seats, as any responsible parent would ensure. They trusted their mother completely, as children do. They had no reason not to. But Amanda Stott-Smith had reached a breaking point. Her marriage was falling apart. Her husband, Jason Smith, had filed for divorce. She was facing the reality of shared custody, of holidays split between 2 homes, of her children calling another woman mom, if Jason remarried. In Amanda's troubled mind, if she couldn't have her children full-time, then no one would have them at all. She stopped the car on the bridge. The Willamette River flowed dark and cold 100 feet below. Amanda got out, opened the back doors, and one by one, she dropped her children over the railing into the black water. Trinity, the 7-year-old, somehow survived the fall. She hit the water and fought her way to the surface, struggling against the current, screaming for help in the darkness. A nearby boater heard her cries and pulled her from the river, hypothermic and traumatized but alive. 4-year-old Eldon wasn't as fortunate. His small body couldn't withstand the impact. Search and rescue teams found him the next day, his life stolen by the woman who gave it to him. Amanda Stott-Smith didn't jump after her children. She didn't throw herself from the bridge in a fit of despair. Instead, she drove away. She went to a local hospital and checked herself in, claiming she was suicidal. It was a calculated move, an attempt to establish an insanity defense before anyone knew what she'd done. But Trinity was already talking to investigators. Through tears and trauma, the 7-year-old told police what her mother had done. She described being taken from the car, being held over the railing, and then the sickening sensation of falling through darkness. She described hitting the water, the cold shock of it, the desperate fight to breathe. She described calling for her little brother in the Black River and getting no answer. The story that emerged during the investigation was one of a bitter custody battle that had consumed Amanda Stott-Smith. Friends and family described her as increasingly unstable, obsessed with preventing Jason from having any relationship with the children. She had made threats. She had said things that, in hindsight, were clear warning signs. "If I can't have them, no one will," she told multiple people. But no one believed she would actually follow through. The prosecution argued that Amanda's actions were premeditated murder. She had driven to the bridge with the specific intent of killing her children. She had chosen a location where their chances of survival were minimal. She had checked herself into a hospital afterward to establish a mental health defense. Every action showed planning, calculation, and intent. The defense team tried to argue that Amanda was suffering from severe mental illness, that she wasn't in her right mind when she committed the act. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about her depression, her anxiety, her inability to cope with the divorce. They painted her as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had snapped under unbearable pressure. But the jury heard Trinity's testimony. They heard the little girl describe her mother's actions in heartbreaking detail. They saw the evidence of premeditation, the calculated nature of Amanda's choices. And they didn't buy the insanity defense. In February of 2010, Amanda Stott-Smith was convicted of murder, attempted murder, and attempted aggravated murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Even the possibility of eventual freedom seemed too generous to many observers. After all, Eldon would never have the possibility of freedom. He would never have the possibility of growing up, of going to school, of falling in love, of having children of his own. His mother had taken all of that from him in one terrible moment on a dark bridge. Trinity survived, but her survival came at an enormous cost. She carries the physical scars of that night, the injuries from the fall, the trauma of nearly drowning. But the emotional scars run even deeper. She watched her mother murder her little brother. She experienced the ultimate betrayal. No amount of therapy, no amount of time, can fully heal those wounds. Jason Smith, the children's father, was left to pick up the pieces. He raised Trinity alone, helping her navigate the impossible grief of losing her brother and her mother simultaneously. He had to explain to a 7-year-old why her mommy had done something so evil. There are no good answers to such questions. The Selwood Bridge has since been replaced with a new structure, but Portlanders who remember that night still think of it as the place where a mother's love turned into a mother's rage. Memorial flowers appeared on the bridge in the days after Eldon's death, left by strangers who wept for a little boy they never knew. Amanda Stott-Smith spent her years in prison maintaining that she was sick, that she wasn't responsible for her actions. But the letters she wrote, the statements she made, revealed someone who understood exactly what she'd done. In one letter, she wrote about her regret, not for killing Eldon, but for the fact that Trinity had survived to testify against her. In June of 2023, Amanda Stott-Smith died in custody. The Oregon Department of Corrections didn't release details about her death, citing privacy concerns. She was 50 years old. She had served 13 years of her life sentence. Some people felt her death was too easy an escape. Others felt it was a form of justice that she would never again see the outside world, never again feel sunshine on her face or breathe free air. Trinity is an adult now, trying to build a life from the wreckage of her childhood. She's requested privacy, asked the media to let her heal away from the spotlight. Her father has honored that request, protecting her from the curiosity of a world that wants to know how someone survives such a thing. The answer is, you don't survive unchanged. You survive broken, and you spend the rest of your life figuring out how to live with the pieces. The Willamette River continues to flow through Portland, dark and cold, carrying its secrets. Somewhere in its depths is the memory of a 4-year-old boy who should have grown up to be a man. Instead, he's frozen in time, forever 4 years old, forever falling through darkness because his mother decided he was better off dead than living with his father. The case of Amanda Stott-Smith reminds us that evil doesn't always look like evil. It looks like a mother driving her children in the car. It looks like ordinary moments that suddenly, horrifically, become extraordinary nightmares. And it reminds us that the people we're supposed to trust most in the world are sometimes the most dangerous of all. If these stories are opening your eyes to the darkness that exists even in the most unexpected places, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support helps us continue investigating these important cases. Hit that subscribe button now. Case 3. Angela McAnulty. Date of crime, December 9, 2009. Location, Eugene, Oregon. 6 months after Amanda Stott-Smith dropped her children from a bridge, another Oregon mother was engaged in a different kind of horror. This one didn't happen in a single terrible moment. This one happened slowly, methodically, over months and years. This one was torture. 15-year-old Jeanette Maples weighed 56 pounds when she died. For context, a healthy 15-year-old girl typically weighs between 100 and 140 pounds. Jeanette weighed less than many first graders. She weighed less than some toddlers. Her body was covered in bruises, cuts, and scars. Her hair had been pulled out in clumps. She had been starved, beaten, and tortured by the one person who should have protected her above all others, her mother, Angela McAnulty. On December 9, 2009, Jeanette's body was discovered in the mobile home she shared with her mother, stepfather, and siblings in Eugene, Oregon. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy would later say it was the worst case of child abuse he had ever seen. And he'd seen many. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse so systematic, so calculated, that it defied comprehension. Angela McAnulty had been torturing Jeanette for years. She forced the teenager to sleep in a closet. She denied her food while the rest of the family ate normally. She beat her with various objects, belts, hangers, fists. She pulled out her hair as punishment. She used a taser on her. She forced her to do wall sits for hours, punishing her if she faltered. The other children in the home witnessed this abuse, but were too terrified to intervene. Angela had created an atmosphere of fear so complete that no one dared to help Jeanette or report what was happening. The stepfather, Richard McAnulty, was aware of the abuse but did nothing to stop it. Later, investigators would charge him as well, though his culpability was secondary to Angela's direct actions. Jeanette had attended school sporadically over the years, but Angela eventually pulled her out, claiming she would homeschool her. This is a common tactic among child abusers, removing the victim from any outside observers who might notice the abuse and report it. Once Jeanette was isolated at home, Angela's torture intensified. Teachers who had known Jeanette remembered her as a sweet, quiet girl who seemed increasingly withdrawn. They remembered her losing weight, becoming more fearful, but they didn't see the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors. No one did until it was too late. The prosecution built a case that painted Angela McAnulty as a sadist who targeted one specific child out of malice. Why did she single out Jeanette? Investigators found evidence suggesting that Jeanette was from a previous relationship, and Angela resented her. She saw the teenager as a burden, as someone else's child, as an inconvenience. So she set about systematically destroying her. The abuse escalated in the months before Jeanette's death. Angela's punishments became more severe, more frequent. She seemed to enjoy inflicting pain. Family members later testified that Angela would laugh while beating Jeanette, that she seemed to derive pleasure from the girl's suffering. On December 9th, Jeanette's malnourished, battered body finally gave out. Angela discovered her unresponsive and called 911, claiming she didn't know what had happened. But when paramedics arrived and saw the condition of Jeanette's body, they immediately suspected abuse. The police were called, and within hours, Angela and Richard McAnulty were under arrest. The trial began in March of 2011. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Medical examiners testified about Jeanette's injuries, describing wounds in various stages of healing that indicated prolonged, repeated abuse. Child Protective Services workers testified about the conditions in the home, about the closet where Jeanette was forced to sleep, about the lack of food available to her while the rest of the family had plenty. Jeanette's siblings testified, describing years of watching their sister being tortured. Their testimony was heartbreaking. They talked about hearing Jeanette crying in the night. They talked about watching her being beaten. They talked about being too scared to help because they knew they might become targets themselves. The defense tried to argue that Angela McAnulty suffered from mental illness, that she had been abused herself as a child, that she didn't fully understand the severity of her actions. But the prosecution presented evidence that Angela's abuse was calculated and deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing. She chose when and how to inflict pain. She made sure to avoid leaving marks where others might see them when Jeanette was still attending school. Her actions showed planning and awareness. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: aggravated murder, murder by abuse, and criminal mistreatment. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the circumstances of Jeanette's death were so egregious that the ultimate punishment was justified. In December of 2011, the jury agreed. Angela McAnulty was sentenced to death, becoming one of only 2 women on Oregon's death row. The sentence sent a message: even a mother who commits such evil will be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. But Oregon has a complicated relationship with the death penalty. In 2011, then-Governor John Kitzhaber issued a moratorium on executions, effectively halting all death sentences in the state. When Kate Brown became governor, she continued the moratorium. Angela McAnulty would sit on death row, but she would not be executed. In 2020, Angela's death sentence was overturned on appeal due to issues with jury instructions. She was re-sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will die behind bars, but she will not die by execution. For many who knew Jeanette's story, this was a bitter pill. They felt that Angela deserved the death penalty, that anything less was an insult to Jeanette's memory. Jeanette Maples never got to experience teenage life. She never went to prom. She never had a first kiss. She never got to drive a car, graduate high school, go to college, fall in love, have a career, have children. All of those possibilities were stolen from her by the woman who was supposed to nurture and protect her. Eugene, Oregon, was shaken by Jeanette's death. The community held vigils, left flowers, wept for a girl most of them had never known. But more importantly, the case sparked conversations about how to identify and prevent child abuse. Teachers were trained to recognize warning signs. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicions. The system that had failed Jeanette was scrutinized and reformed. But no amount of reform can bring Jeanette back. She's buried in a small cemetery in Eugene, her grave marked with a simple stone. People who never knew her still visit sometimes, leaving flowers and teddy bears, mourning a child who suffered so much and received so little love. Angela McAnulty sits in Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, Oregon's prison for women. She'll remain there until she dies. She has appealed her conviction multiple times, always unsuccessfully. She has shown no genuine remorse for what she did to Jeanette. In letters and statements, she has tried to paint herself as the victim, claiming she was overwhelmed and didn't know how to cope with a difficult child. But Jeanette wasn't a difficult child. She was a child being tortured, and she coped with grace and endurance that no child should ever have to muster. She survived years of abuse before her body finally gave out. She was stronger than her mother in every way that mattered. The case of Angela McAnulty is a reminder that child abuse often happens in plain sight. Neighbors heard things. Teachers saw things. But the reporting didn't happen until it was too late. It's a call to action for all of us to be vigilant, to speak up when we suspect a child is in danger, to be willing to make the uncomfortable phone call to authorities. Because somewhere right now, there's another Jeanette. Another child being abused behind closed doors. Another child hoping someone will notice, someone will help. We have to be those someones. We have to be the people who see and speak up. We have to be the ones who refuse to let another child suffer in silence. This case represents one of the darkest chapters in Oregon's history. If it's moved you to think about the children in your own community, Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We shine light on cases that need to be remembered. Click that subscribe button and join us in never forgetting. Case 4. Jeannace, June Freeman. Date of crime: May 11th, 1961. Location: Crooked River Gorge, Oregon. We step back in time now to an era before DNA evidence, before extensive forensic science, before the modern true crime boom. We step back to 1961, when a woman named Jeannace June Freeman committed a crime so shocking that she would become the first woman sentenced to death in Oregon's history. May 11th, 1961, was supposed to be a normal day. Gertrude Jackson was at her home in Crooked River, Oregon, with her 2 children, 6-year-old Larry and 4-year-old Martha. Gertrude's partner, Robert Freeman, worked long hours, and his sister Jeannace had recently moved in to help with childcare. Jeannace Freeman was 29 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts, deeply unhappy with her life. She felt trapped, resentful of her role as caregiver to children who weren't her own. She wanted freedom. She wanted independence. And like the other women in this documentary, she was willing to commit the unthinkable to get what she wanted. On that May afternoon, Jeannace told Gertrude she would take the children for a drive. It wasn't an unusual request. She'd taken them out before, giving Gertrude a break from parenting duties. Gertrude agreed, helped buckle the children into the car, and waved goodbye as Jeannace drove away. She would never see Larry or Martha alive again. Jeannace drove the children to the Crooked River Gorge, a bridge that spanned a deep canyon carved by the river below. The gorge was 300 feet deep in places, a dramatic scar in the Oregon landscape. The bridge was high, isolated, and perfect for what Jeannace had planned. She stopped the car, got the children out, and walked them toward the edge. Larry and Martha trusted her completely. She was Aunt Jeannace, family, someone who was supposed to keep them safe. They held her hands as she led them to the railing. And then, without warning, without mercy, Jeannace picked up 6-year-old Larry and threw him over the edge. The little boy fell 300 feet into the rocky gorge below. Before 4-year-old Martha could even process what had happened to her brother, Jeannace threw her over as well. Jeannace drove away, leaving the children's bodies in the gorge. She went home and told Gertrude that the children had wanted to stay with friends, that she'd drop them off and would pick them up later. It was a flimsy story, one that started to crumble almost immediately. When the children didn't come home that evening, Gertrude began to worry. She questioned Jeannace about where exactly she'd left them. Jeannace's story kept changing. First, it was one friend's house. Then another. Then she couldn't quite remember the address. Gertrude's worry turned to panic, and she called the police. Detectives interviewed Jeannace and found her story riddled with inconsistencies. They pressed her, questioned her, didn't let up. And eventually, under the weight of their interrogation, Jeannace broke. She confessed to throwing the children from the Crooked River Gorge. Search teams were dispatched to the gorge immediately. It took hours of searching in the treacherous terrain, but they eventually recovered the bodies of Larry and Martha Jackson. Both children had died from the fall, their small bodies broken on the rocks below. The confession shocked Oregon. This was 1961, a time when women were still viewed through a very traditional lens. The idea that a woman could murder children, any children, let alone children in her care, was almost incomprehensible to the public. Women were supposed to be nurturers, caregivers, protectors. Jeannace Freeman shattered that assumption. The trial was swift by modern standards. Jeannace was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution had her confession. They had the bodies. They had clear evidence of premeditation. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, suggesting that Jeannace wasn't in her right mind. But the confession showed planning. She'd chosen the location carefully. She'd lied to cover up her actions. She knew exactly what she was doing. The jury found her guilty on both counts. And then came the sentencing phase, where the prosecution asked for something unprecedented, the death penalty for a woman. Oregon had executed men before, but never a woman. The idea was controversial. Some people felt that women shouldn't be subject to capital punishment, that it was too harsh, too unnatural. Others felt that equality under the law meant that women who committed capital crimes should face the same consequences as men. The judge sided with the prosecution. Jeannace June Freeman was sentenced to death by hanging, becoming the first woman in Oregon history to receive a death sentence. But she would never be executed. Her sentence was commuted to life in prison, and she began serving her time in the Oregon Women's Correctional Center. For 24 years, she lived behind bars, removed from society, paying for her crimes. In 1985, Jeannace Freeman was granted parole. She had served her time, participated in rehabilitation programs, and convinced the parole board that she was no longer a danger to society. She was released, given a new chance at life that Larry and Martha Jackson never got. Jeannace lived quietly after her release. She kept a low profile, avoided the media, and tried to disappear into anonymity. She died in 2003 at the age of 71, taking whatever remained of her conscience to the grave. The case of Jeannace Freeman is significant for several reasons. First, it established legal precedent that women could and would be held accountable for violent crimes to the same degree as men. The sentencing judge made it clear that gender would not be a shield against appropriate punishment. Second, it was one of the earliest high-profile cases in Oregon involving a female child killer. The trial was covered extensively in newspapers, and the public's fascination with the case revealed a deep discomfort with the idea of women as perpetrators of violence, especially against children. Third, it raised questions about parole and rehabilitation that remain relevant today. Should someone who murdered 2 children ever be released from prison? Jeannace Freeman served 24 years and was granted parole. She apparently lived the rest of her life without committing further crimes. Does that mean the system worked? Or does it mean that Larry and Martha's lives were valued at 12 years each? The amount of time Jeannace served per murder? These are uncomfortable questions without easy answers. But they're important to ask because they force us to think about what justice actually means. Is it punishment? Rehabilitation? Protection of society? Acknowledgement of victims? Perhaps it's all of these things, in a balance that's never quite perfect. Gertrude Jackson had to live with the knowledge that she'd trusted the wrong person with her children. She'd let them go with someone she thought was safe, someone she thought was family, and they'd been murdered. That guilt, that horror, must have been unbearable. She had to bury her babies and somehow find a way to keep living. Robert Freeman lost his sister and his partner's children in one terrible act. The family was destroyed, shattered beyond repair. There was no coming back from what Jeannace had done. The Crooked River Gorge still stands, still draws tourists who come to admire its dramatic beauty. Most of them don't know about the 2 children whose lives ended there in May of 1961. There's no memorial, no marker, nothing to indicate that the gorge was once the site of unspeakable evil. But the people of Crooked River remember. The older residents, the ones who were alive in 1961, still tell the story to younger generations. They point to the bridge and say, "That's where it happened. That's where Jeannace Freeman threw those children." Memory is important. These stories need to be told, not because we enjoy the darkness, but because we need to remember the victims. Larry and Martha Jackson deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be more than footnotes in Oregon criminal history. They deserve to be seen as the children they were, innocent, trusting, full of potential that was stolen from them by someone they called family. If you believe these victims deserve to be remembered, please hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We tell the stories that time tries to forget. Subscribe now and help us keep these memories alive. Case 5. Nemoria Lynn Villagomez. Date of crime, May 26, 2018. Location, Newport, Oregon. Newport, Oregon, is a coastal town known for its fishing industry, its historic bayfront, and its stunning Pacific Ocean views. It's the kind of place where people move to escape the chaos of bigger cities, where they raise their families in relative peace and safety. But on May 26, 2018, that sense of safety was shattered when a mother turned a knife on her own child. 6-year-old Mason was a bright, energetic boy who loved school, loved playing outside, loved being a kid. He lived with his mother, Nemoria Lynn Villagomez, in a modest home in Newport. Neighbors described them as a quiet family, nothing unusual, nothing that raised red flags. But behind closed doors, something was very wrong. On that May evening, Nemoria's mental state deteriorated rapidly. The exact trigger remains unclear. Perhaps it was stress, perhaps untreated mental illness, perhaps substance abuse. Whatever the cause, Nemoria experienced what authorities would later describe as a psychotic episode. And in the midst of that episode, she attacked her son. Nemoria stabbed Mason multiple times with a kitchen knife. The 6-year-old screamed, tried to defend himself, tried to understand why his mother was hurting him. But there was no understanding to be found. This was senseless violence, an attack driven by something broken inside Nemoria's mind. Neighbors heard the commotion and called 911. Police and paramedics arrived to find Mason severely injured, bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Nemoria was still at the scene, the knife nearby, her clothes covered in her son's blood. She didn't resist arrest. She didn't try to flee. She stood there, seemingly detached from reality, as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. Mason was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked frantically to save his life. The stab wounds had caused significant damage, and there were moments when it seemed uncertain whether he would survive. But the medical team was skilled, and Mason was a fighter. Against the odds, he pulled through. The physical recovery was long and painful. Mason endured multiple surgeries, weeks in the hospital, months of rehabilitation. The wounds healed, though he was left with scars that would mark his body for the rest of his life. But physical scars are only part of the story. The psychological trauma of being attacked by your own mother is profound and lasting. Mason would need therapy for years, possibly for the rest of his life, to process what happened to him. How do you make sense of the fact that the person who was supposed to protect you tried to kill you? How do you learn to trust again when your first betrayal came from your mother? Nemoria Villagomez was arrested and charged with attempted murder and assault. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: the crime scene, the witnesses, Mason's injuries, Nemoria's presence at the scene with the weapon. The defense didn't dispute that Nemoria had attacked her son. Instead, they focused on her mental state, arguing that she was suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the attack. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Nemoria had a history of mental health issues. She had struggled with depression, anxiety, and possible psychotic symptoms. She hadn't been receiving consistent treatment. She hadn't been taking medication regularly. The defense argued that she wasn't responsible for her actions because she wasn't in control of her own mind. It's a difficult argument to navigate. On one hand, mental illness is real and can profoundly affect a person's behavior and judgment. People experiencing psychotic episodes may truly not understand what they're doing, may not be able to control their actions. On the other hand, a child was stabbed multiple times and nearly died. Does the explanation of mental illness change the fact of the attack? Does it make Mason any less traumatized? These questions don't have easy answers. The legal system tries to balance accountability with recognition of mental illness, but that balance is always imperfect. In Nemoria's case, the prosecution and defense reached a plea agreement. Nemoria pleaded guilty to second-degree assault and attempted aggravated murder. In exchange for her guilty plea, she received a sentence of 10 years in prison. It was significantly less than the maximum sentence she could have received, but it reflected the court's recognition that mental illness was a significant factor in her actions. 10 years. That's what Mason's attack was worth in the eyes of the law. By the time Nemoria is released from prison, Mason will be a teenager, then a young adult. He'll have grown up without his mother, which is probably for the best given what she did to him. But he'll also have grown up marked by trauma, by the knowledge that his own mother tried to kill him. Mason is now in the care of family members who love him and are committed to his healing. They've shielded him from media attention, protected his privacy, given him the space to be a child as much as possible. Reports indicate that he's doing well, all things considered. He's back in school, making friends, finding joy where he can. But the attack changed him. How could it not? He's more cautious now, more aware that the world isn't always safe, that even the people you love most can hurt you. He's lost a certain innocence that most 6-year-olds still have, the belief that mom and dad will always keep you safe. The case raises important questions about mental health care and intervention. Nemoria Villagomez was clearly struggling before the attack. Were there signs that someone could have noticed? Were there opportunities for intervention that were missed? Could Mason's attack have been prevented if Nemoria had received better mental health support? The answer is, possibly. But mental health care in America is notoriously underfunded and difficult to access. People fall through the cracks all the time. They don't get the treatment they need until it's too late, until something terrible has already happened. This isn't to excuse what Nemoria did. She's responsible for her actions, mental illness or not. But it is a reminder that our systems are failing people, And when those systems fail, innocent children pay the price. Newport, Oregon, rallied around Mason after the attack. The community held fundraisers to help with his medical expenses. Local businesses donated services and supplies. Neighbors provided meals and support to the family members caring for him. In the midst of horror, there was also humanity, people coming together to help a child who desperately needed it. Nemoria Villagomez is currently incarcerated, receiving mental health treatment as part of her sentence. She'll be eligible for release in 2029, at which point she'll be 40 years old. She'll have a criminal record, a history of violence, and a son who may never want to see her again. That's the future she created for herself on May 26, 2018, when she picked up a knife and attacked the child she'd brought into the world. The story of Nemoria and Mason doesn't have a clear moral. It's messy and complicated, full of gray areas where mental illness intersects with criminal behavior, where sympathy for the perpetrator conflicts with horror at the crime. Real life is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be. What is clear is that Mason deserved better. He deserved a mother who was healthy and stable. He deserved to grow up without trauma. He deserved childhood innocence that wasn't stolen by violence. And while he can't get those things back, he can have a future. He can heal, grow, thrive. He can become more than what happened to him. That's the hope we hold on to in cases like these, that the victims can survive not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. That they can build lives that aren't defined solely by their trauma. That they can find happiness despite everything they've been through. Mason is young. He has his whole life ahead of him. And with the right support, the right care, the right love from people who truly want what's best for him, he can have a good life. Not an easy life, not an unmarked life, but a good one nonetheless. Cases like this remind us how fragile safety can be. If you're invested in these stories and want to see more deep investigations, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your engagement helps us continue this important work. Hit that subscribe button now. Case 6, Sharday McDonald. Date of crime, October 28, 2021. Location, Gresham, Oregon. Not all the cases in this documentary involve death, but they all involve betrayal of the deepest kind, a mother's betrayal of her child. And sometimes, the fact that a child survived doesn't make the crime any less horrifying. Sometimes, survival means living with trauma that will echo through every day of the rest of your life. Sharday McDonald was a young mother living in Gresham, a suburb east of Portland. She had an infant son, just months old, completely dependent on her for everything. And on October 28, 2021, she subjected that helpless baby to torture that almost defies belief. Sharday's boyfriend was the child's father, but their relationship was troubled. They fought constantly, broke up and got back together, engaged in the toxic cycle that characterizes so many dysfunctional relationships. And somewhere in Sharday's troubled mind, she decided to use their son as a test, a way to see if the father truly cared about the child. What she did was monstrous. Sharday waterboarded her infant son. She poured water over the baby's face, intentionally triggering the drowning reflex, causing him to choke and gasp for air. For those who don't know, waterboarding is a form of torture so severe that it's considered a war crime when used on enemy combatants. Sharday used it on her own baby. But she didn't stop there. After waterboarding the infant, she placed him in a freezer. The baby, already traumatized and struggling, was subjected to extreme cold. The temperature in a typical freezer is around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. An infant's body can't regulate temperature the way an adult's can. Putting a baby in a freezer is potentially fatal. Sharday took photos and videos of the abuse. She documented what she was doing, creating evidence that would later prove crucial in her prosecution. She sent these images to the baby's father, apparently expecting him to rush over, to prove his love for his child by rescuing the baby from her abuse. The father did rush over, but not for the reasons Sharday expected. He wasn't playing into her twisted test. He was horrified. He immediately called the police and reported what Sharday had done. Officers arrived at Sharday's home and found the infant in distress but alive. The baby was taken to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. Medical staff found evidence consistent with the abuse described, signs of water in the lungs, hypothermia, trauma. The baby survived, but what he'd been through was unthinkable. Sharday McDonald was arrested and charged with criminal mistreatment and assault. The evidence was overwhelming. The photos and videos she'd taken became exhibits in court, shocking everyone who saw them. The prosecution argued that Sharday's actions were intentional, calculated, and designed to cause suffering to an innocent child. The defense tried to argue that Sharday was suffering from postpartum depression and wasn't thinking clearly. They painted her as a woman overwhelmed by motherhood, struggling with mental health issues, making terrible decisions in the midst of a crisis. They asked for leniency, but the prosecution countered that Sharday's actions showed planning and intent. She hadn't acted in a moment of panic or confusion. She had deliberately subjected her son to torture, documented it, and used it as a manipulation tactic in her relationship. That's not the behavior of someone temporarily overwhelmed. That's the behavior of someone willing to abuse her child for her own purposes. In 2023, Sharday McDonald pleaded guilty to the charges against her. The sentence she received shocked many observers and sparked outrage. 30 days in jail and 3 years of probation. 30 days. That's 1 month behind bars for waterboarding an infant and putting him in a freezer. The sentence was so light that it barely qualified as punishment. The judge justified it by citing Sharday's mental health issues, her lack of prior criminal record, and her willingness to participate in treatment programs. But to many people, the sentence sent a terrible message that child abuse, even extreme abuse, might not be taken seriously by the courts. That a mother can torture her infant and walk away with minimal consequences. That a baby's suffering is worth 30 days of jail time. The sentence sparked conversations about how the legal system handles cases involving mothers who abuse their children. There's often a reluctance to punish mothers harshly, based on assumptions about maternal instinct and the importance of keeping mothers with their children. But at what point does that reluctance become complicity in abuse? At what point do we acknowledge that some mothers are dangerous and need to be separated from their children permanently? Sharday's son was removed from her custody. He's now being raised by other family members in an environment free from abuse. He's too young to remember what happened to him, which is perhaps the only mercy in this entire story. He won't carry conscious memories of being waterboarded, of being placed in a freezer, of being used as a pawn in his mother's twisted game. But trauma has a way of embedding itself in the body, even when the mind doesn't remember. Researchers have found that infants who experience abuse show altered stress responses, changed brain development, and increased risk of anxiety and attachment disorders later in life. Even if Sharday's son doesn't remember what happened, his body remembers. His nervous system remembers. The case raises uncomfortable questions about postpartum mental health. Sharday's defense team argued that she was suffering from postpartum depression, and that may well be true. Postpartum depression is a serious condition that affects many new mothers. It can cause intrusive thoughts, overwhelming anxiety, and impaired judgment. But postpartum depression doesn't typically lead to torture. Most women suffering from postpartum depression don't waterboard their babies. They struggle with bonding. They feel overwhelmed. They may have thoughts of harming themselves or their children that terrify them. But they don't act on those thoughts in the deliberate, calculated way that Sharday did. So while mental health may have been a factor, it can't be the entire explanation. There was something else going on with Sharday McDonald, something that allowed her to torture an infant and document it, something that overrode every natural protective instinct a mother should have. The case also highlights the role of toxic relationships in child abuse. Sharday's actions were motivated by her relationship with the baby's father. She was using the baby to manipulate him, to test him, to control him. The child wasn't a person to her in that moment. He was a tool, a means to an end. This pattern shows up again and again in cases of parental abuse. Children become pawns in adult conflicts. They become weapons used by one parent against the other. And in the process, they suffer trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Sharday McDonald completed her 30-day jail sentence and is currently on probation. She's required to participate in mental health treatment and parenting classes. She's not allowed to have unsupervised contact with her son. If she completes probation successfully, she'll have a criminal record but will otherwise be able to move on with her life. Her son, meanwhile, will grow up knowing that his mother tortured him. At some point, someone will have to tell him what happened. He'll have to grapple with the knowledge that the woman who gave him life also subjected him to one of the most horrifying forms of abuse imaginable. How do you process that as a child? As a teenager? As an adult, how do you build a sense of safety and trust when your first experience in the world was betrayal by the person who should have protected you? These are questions that therapists and counselors will help him work through in the years to come. But there are no easy answers, no simple paths to healing from this kind of trauma. The community's response to Sharday's light sentence was mixed. Some people argued that she needed treatment, not incarceration, and that the sentence reflected a more enlightened approach to criminal justice. Others argued that the sentence was a travesty, that it failed to hold Sharday accountable for her actions, and that it sent a dangerous message about how society values children. Both perspectives have merit, which is what makes the case so difficult to navigate. Yes, Sharday needed mental health treatment. Yes, incarceration isn't always the answer. But also yes, what she did was horrifying and deserved more serious consequences. These truths can coexist. What can't be disputed is that an infant was tortured and that the person who did it got 30 days in jail. Whatever your perspective on criminal justice, that fact is disturbing. The case of Sharday McDonald reminds us that child abuse happens in every community, at every socioeconomic level, in every type of family. It reminds us that abusers don't always look like monsters. They look like regular people, like young mothers, like neighbors you'd never suspect. And it reminds us that the systems designed to protect children, law enforcement, the courts, child protective services, don't always get it right. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes the sentences don't fit the crimes. Sometimes children fall through the cracks. We have to do better. We have to demand better. Because every child deserves protection, deserves safety, deserves a mother who would die before harming them. And when that's not what they get, the least we can do is hold abusers accountable. If this case has made you think about the justice system and how it handles child abuse, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. We investigate the cases that make us uncomfortable because they're the ones that need attention. Subscribe now. Case 7. Angelina Minor. Date of crime: March 20th, 2024. Location: North Portland, Oregon. Sometimes evil doesn't announce itself with premeditation. Sometimes it arrives in the form of recklessness so extreme that the outcome is inevitable. Sometimes a mother doesn't set out to kill her child, but her choices make death the only possible result. This is the story of Angelina Minor and the night she got behind the wheel drunk with her 4-year-old son in the car. March 20th, 2024, was a Wednesday evening in North Portland. Kingston R. Costin, just 4 years old, was in the back seat of his mother's car. He was probably tired, maybe sleepy, possibly excited about wherever they were going. He trusted his mother completely, as 4-year-olds do. He had no idea that these would be the final moments of his short life. Angelina Minor was drunk. She'd been drinking, and then she'd made the decision to drive with her son in the car. She got behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled out onto the street. Her blood alcohol content would later be measured at more than twice the legal limit. She was profoundly impaired, in no condition to operate a vehicle, especially not with a child in her care. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, Angelina's car crashed. The exact details of the crash are straightforward. She was driving too fast. Her reactions were slowed by alcohol. She lost control of the vehicle. The car struck another object with tremendous force. The impact was catastrophic. Kingston, secured in his car seat in the back, took the full force of the collision. The 4-year-old's small body couldn't withstand the trauma. He was killed instantly, his life ending in a moment of twisted metal and shattered glass. Emergency responders arrived at the scene to find devastation. Kingston was pronounced dead at the scene. Angelina survived with injuries, but was conscious. She would have to live with the knowledge that she'd killed her own son, that her decision to drive drunk had stolen his future. The investigation was straightforward. Blood tests confirmed Angelina's level of intoxication. Crash reconstruction experts determined that speed and impaired driving were the causes. Witnesses confirmed that Angelina had been drinking before getting in the car. There was no question about what had happened or who was responsible. Angelina Minor was arrested and charged with manslaughter, driving under the influence, and reckless endangerment. The charges carried significant prison time. The prosecution argued that Angelina's choices were criminally negligent, that she'd shown callous disregard for her son's safety, and that Kingston's death was the direct result of her recklessness. The defense tried to argue that Angelina hadn't intended to hurt her son, that this was a tragic accident rather than a crime. They portrayed her as a mother who made a terrible mistake, who would have to live with the consequences for the rest of her life, who was already punished by grief and guilt. But the prosecution countered that drunk driving with a child in the car isn't an accident. It's a choice. Angelina chose to drink. She chose to get behind the wheel. She chose to put Kingston in the car. Every one of those choices led inevitably to his death. Intent doesn't matter when the outcome is so predictable. The trial drew significant media attention. Drunk driving cases involving child fatalities often do. People are horrified by the idea that a parent would be so reckless, so selfish, that they'd endanger their own child. The courtroom was packed with observers, many of them parents who couldn't fathom making the choices Angelina had made. Kingston's father attended the trial, grief-stricken and furious. He'd lost his son because of the mother's recklessness. He testified about Kingston, about the bright, energetic 4-year-old who loved dinosaurs and trucks, who was just beginning to learn his letters, who had his whole life ahead of him. He described the pain of identifying his son's body, of planning a funeral for a child, of facing a future without the boy he'd loved more than anything. The testimony was heartbreaking. Jurors wept. Observers wept. Even the judge seemed affected by the raw grief in the courtroom. In January of 2026, just weeks ago, Angelina Minor was sentenced to 125 months in prison, just over 10 years. The sentence reflected the seriousness of her crime while also acknowledging that she hadn't intended to kill Kingston. It was a middle ground sentence, neither the maximum nor the minimum, an attempt to balance justice with the complicated reality of the situation. 10 years. That's what Kingston's life was worth in the eyes of the law. By the time Angelina is released, she'll be in her late 30s. She'll have missed more than a decade. But Kingston missed everything. He missed his whole life. The case of Angelina Minor is different from some of the others in this documentary. She didn't set out to kill her son. She didn't abuse him, didn't torture him, didn't throw him from a bridge. But the end result was the same: a dead child and a mother responsible for that death. Does intent matter? In the legal system, it matters enormously. The difference between murder and manslaughter is intent. Murder is deliberate. Manslaughter is reckless or negligent. The law recognizes that there's a difference between planning to kill someone and causing their death through carelessness. But from the victim's perspective, does it matter? Kingston is just as dead whether his mother meant to kill him or not. His father's grief is just as profound. The loss to the community is just as real. These are philosophical questions that each person has to answer for themselves. What is clear is that Angelina's choices were criminally negligent. She knew, or should have known, that drunk driving with a child in the car could result in injury or death. She did it anyway, and Kingston paid the price for her recklessness. The case has sparked renewed conversations about drunk driving and child safety. Oregon, like most states, has strict laws about drunk driving. But laws don't prevent people from making bad choices. Every day, people get behind the wheel impaired. Most of them make it home without incident, and so they do it again and again, until eventually, luck runs out and someone gets hurt. Kingston Costin's death was preventable. If Angelina hadn't been drinking, he'd be alive. If she'd called a taxi or a rideshare, he'd be alive. If she'd asked a friend for a ride, he'd be alive. There were dozens of alternative choices she could have made. She made none of them. Why do people drive drunk? The reasons vary. Sometimes it's denial. People convince themselves they're not that impaired, that they're fine to drive. Sometimes it's pride. They don't want to admit they've had too much to drink. Sometimes it's convenience. Calling a cab seems like too much hassle. And sometimes it's just plain selfishness. They want what they want, and they don't care about the risk. Whatever Angelina's reasons were, they resulted in her son's death. And now she sits in prison, living with that knowledge every day. Some people might think that's punishment enough. Others might think 10 years isn't nearly enough time for taking a child's life. North Portland held a vigil for Kingston after his death. Neighbors, strangers, and community members gathered to light candles, share memories, and mourn a 4-year-old they'd never met. Someone placed a small collection of toy trucks at the crash site, a tribute to a little boy who loved them. The memorial stayed there for weeks, with people adding flowers and notes, refusing to let Kingston be forgotten. Kingston's father is trying to rebuild his life, but it's a life forever marked by tragedy. He's become an advocate for stricter drunk driving laws, speaking at community events, sharing his story, hoping that Kingston's death might prevent another family from experiencing the same loss. It's noble work, but it doesn't bring Kingston back. Nothing brings him back. Angelina Minor has shown remorse, by all accounts. She's expressed grief and guilt for what she did. She's participated in substance abuse treatment programs in prison. She's written letters of apology to Kingston's father, though he's never responded. She's doing what the system asks of her, trying to demonstrate that she's changed, that she's learned, that she'll never make the same mistake again. But the question remains, does remorse undo harm? Does feeling sorry about killing your child make it better? These are questions without good answers. What we can say is that Kingston Costin deserved better. He deserved a mother who would protect him, who would make safe choices, who would value his life above her convenience or her desire to drink. He deserved to grow up, to go to kindergarten, to learn to read, to make friends, to experience all the joys and challenges of childhood. Instead, his life ended at 4 years old in a car crash that never should have happened. The case serves as a stark reminder: drunk driving kills. It kills passengers, it kills other drivers, it kills pedestrians. And sometimes, it kills the children of the people who choose to drive impaired. If you're ever in a situation where you've been drinking and you're considering driving, remember Kingston. Remember that a few minutes of inconvenience calling a cab could mean the difference between life and death. Remember that your choices have consequences that ripple far beyond yourself. And if you see someone about to drive drunk, especially with children in the car, intervene. Call them a cab. Take their keys. Do whatever it takes to prevent them from making a choice that can't be undone. Because somewhere, there's a 4-year-old who deserves to grow up. And it's all of our responsibility to make sure they get that chance. This tragic case reminds us that our choices have consequences. If you're committed to hearing these important stories, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Hit that subscribe button and help us continue sharing stories that matter. Case 8. Tashina Aline Jordan. Date of crime: August 20th, 2018. Location: Bend, Oregon. Bend, Oregon, sits on the eastern edge of the Cascade Mountains, a city known for outdoor recreation, craft breweries, and a quality of life that attracts families from across the country. It's the kind of place where people move to raise their children in a healthy environment, where schools are good and crime is relatively low. But on August 20th, 2018, Bend became the site of a tragedy that no one saw coming. 7-year-old Mason Jordan was a special needs child. He had disabilities that required extra care, extra patience, extra love. By all accounts, his mother, Tashina Aline Jordan, had been providing that care. She was a stay-at-home mom, dedicated to Mason's needs, attending his therapy appointments, working with his teachers, doing everything a mother should do. But underneath the surface, something was breaking. Tashina was struggling. Caring for a special needs child is exhausting work. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no breaks, no vacations, no time off. It requires patience that seems superhuman. And sometimes, people reach their breaking point. On August 20th, Tashina reached hers. The details of what happened are sparse, protected to some degree by Mason's status as a minor victim and Tashina's eventual plea agreement. What is known is that on that August day, Tashina shot her son. She used a firearm to end the life of her 7-year-old disabled child. Mason died from his injuries. The little boy who had already faced so many challenges in his short life, who had fought so hard just to navigate a world not designed for his needs, was killed by the person who was supposed to be his biggest advocate. The police were called to the Jordan home and found Mason's body. Tashina was arrested at the scene. She didn't flee, didn't resist, didn't deny what she'd done. She was taken into custody, and the investigation began. As detectives dug into Tashina's background, they found a woman under enormous stress. Caring for Mason had taken a toll on her mental and emotional health. She'd expressed frustration to friends and family about the challenges she faced. She'd talked about feeling overwhelmed, about not knowing how much longer she could keep going. But she'd never threatened Mason. She'd never given any indication that she might harm him. There were no reports to Child Protective Services, no documented instances of abuse or neglect. On paper, Tashina had been a dedicated mother doing her best under difficult circumstances. So what happened? How does a mother go from caring for her child to shooting him? The answer: according to Tashina's defense team, was severe mental illness. They argued that Tashina had experienced a psychotic break, that she wasn't in her right mind when she killed Mason. Psychiatric evaluations supported this claim. Experts testified that Tashina was suffering from major mental illness at the time of the shooting, that her grasp on reality had slipped, that she believed she was protecting Mason from something worse. This defense, often called guilty except for insanity, is controversial and rarely successful. It requires proving that the defendant was so mentally ill at the time of the crime that they couldn't understand the nature of their actions or know that what they were doing was wrong. In Tashina's case, the defense was successful. In 2020, she pleaded guilty except for insanity to the charge of murdering her son. The court accepted the plea, finding that Tashina had been psychotic at the time of Mason's death. The sentence reflected this finding. Rather than being sent to prison, Tashina was committed to the Oregon State Hospital, a psychiatric facility where she would receive treatment for her mental illness. She would remain there indefinitely, until such time as doctors determined she was no longer a danger to herself or others. This outcome divided public opinion. Some people felt that Tashina had gotten away with murder, that the insanity defense had allowed her to escape justice. They argued that Mason was still dead, that Tashina had still pulled the trigger, and that mental illness shouldn't excuse such a horrific act. Others felt that the outcome was appropriate, that punishing someone for actions taken during a psychotic break doesn't serve justice. They argued that Tashina needed treatment, not punishment, and that confining her to a psychiatric hospital was the right response. Both perspectives have validity. The truth is that cases like Tashina's exist in a gray area where our concepts of justice and mental illness intersect uncomfortably. There's no question that Tashina was mentally ill. Multiple psychiatric evaluations confirmed it. The question is, does that mental illness absolve her of responsibility for killing Mason? In the eyes of the law, it does, at least to some extent. The insanity defense exists because we recognize that people who are truly detached from reality can't be held to the same standard of culpability as people who know what they're doing. But in the eyes of Mason's family, friends, teachers, and therapists, Tashina killed a child who depended on her. Whether she was psychotic or not, Mason is still gone. He still experienced the terror of being shot by his mother. His life still ended years too soon. The case raises difficult questions about support for caregivers. Tashina was caring for a special needs child largely on her own. Were there support systems in place that she wasn't accessing? Or were those systems inadequate or unavailable? Could Mason's death have been prevented if Tashina had received better mental health care or more help with caregiving? These questions don't have clear answers, but they're worth asking. Caring for a special needs child is incredibly demanding work. It requires resources, financial, emotional, and practical, that many families simply don't have. When those resources aren't available, caregivers can reach crisis points. And sometimes, those crisis points result in tragedy. This doesn't excuse what Tashina did, but it does contextualize it. It helps us understand how a mother who genuinely loved her son could end up shooting him. Mason Jordan deserved better. He deserved a mother who was healthy and stable. He deserved access to the support systems that would have kept his family functioning. He deserved to grow up, to continue making progress, to experience whatever joys life had in store for him. Instead, he's buried in a cemetery in Bend, another child victim of maternal violence. Tashina remains at the Oregon State Hospital. She's receiving treatment for her mental illness. Reports indicate that she's stabilized on medication, that she's no longer psychotic, that she's grappling with the reality of what she did. Living with the knowledge that you killed your child must be a special kind of hell. Even with mental illness as a factor, even with diminished capacity, the fact remains, Tashina took Mason's life. She has to live with that forever. Will she ever be released from the hospital? It's possible. If doctors determine that she's no longer a danger, that her mental illness is under control, that she's unlikely to reoffend, she could eventually be discharged. At that point, she'd be released into the community, free to rebuild her life. That possibility disturbs many people. The idea that someone who killed their child could eventually walk free seems wrong, regardless of mental illness. But that's how the system works when someone is found guilty except for insanity. They're committed until they're well, not for a fixed term like a prison sentence. The Bend community was shaken by Mason's death. It's a small city where people know their neighbors, where children play outside, where tragedy feels distant. Mason's murder shattered that sense of security. It forced people to confront the reality that mental illness and violence can happen anywhere, in any family, even in a beautiful city in the high desert of Oregon. Schools where Mason had attended held memorials. Teachers who had worked with him shared memories of a sweet boy who tried so hard, who made progress despite his challenges, who brought joy to those around him. Classmates made cards and drawings, processing their grief in the way children do. Mason's extended family has remained mostly private, avoiding media attention, grieving away from the public eye. They've had to process not just the loss of Mason, but also the complicated reality that his death came at his mother's hands. How do you mourn a child while also grappling with the fact that someone you loved, Tashina, is responsible for that child's death? There are no good answers, no clean resolutions. The family has to find a way forward, carrying grief and confusion and anger all at once. The case of Tashina Jordan is a reminder that mental illness is a serious public health issue. It's not an excuse for violence, but it is a factor that must be considered. People experiencing psychotic breaks are not thinking rationally. They're not in control of their actions in the way that healthy people are. That doesn't make their victims any less dead. It doesn't ease the grief of those left behind. But it does complicate our understanding of responsibility and justice. We need better mental health care in this country. We need better support for caregivers. We need systems that identify people in crisis before they reach the breaking point. We need a society that doesn't leave parents of special needs children to struggle alone. Because Mason Jordan should still be alive. And if the right interventions had been in place, maybe he would be. Mental health and caregiving support are crucial issues that this case highlights. If you're finding value in these deep investigations, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support allows us to keep telling these important stories. Don't forget to subscribe. Case 9, Rebekah Gasperino. Date of crime, April 23, 2022. Location, Albany, Oregon. Albany, Oregon, sits in the heart of the Willamette Valley, a small city of about 50,000 people. It's a quiet place, the kind of community where neighbors know each other, where children ride bikes down tree-lined streets, where life moves at a gentler pace than in Portland or Eugene. But on April 23, 2022, Albany became the site of a mother's crime that would shock even seasoned investigators. 3-year-old Sophia was a bright, energetic toddler. By all accounts, she was a happy child, curious about the world, full of the innocent joy that characterizes early childhood. She lived with her mother, Rebekah Gasperino, in an apartment in Albany. Neighbors occasionally saw them together, noted nothing unusual, thought nothing was wrong. But something was very wrong behind closed doors. On April 23, police responded to a welfare check at Rebekah's apartment. Someone, the details of who and why remain sealed in court documents, had called authorities expressing concern. When police arrived, they made a horrific discovery. Sophia was dead. The child's body showed signs of trauma. This wasn't a natural death, wasn't an accident. This was homicide. Rebekah Gasperino was immediately arrested and charged with her daughter's murder. The investigation revealed a troubled situation. Rebekah had a history of mental health issues and substance abuse. She'd struggled with addiction, had been in and out of treatment programs, had fought battles that many people never overcome. But she'd also been a mother, responsible for a small child who depended on her for everything. The exact circumstances of Sophia's death have not been made public. Court documents remain sealed because of the sensitive nature of the case and Rebekah's subsequent legal status. What is known is that Rebekah was responsible for her daughter's death, that it was not accidental, and that the crime was severe enough to warrant murder charges. But as the legal process moved forward, a complicating factor emerged: Rebekah's mental state. Psychiatric evaluations raised serious questions about whether she was competent to stand trial. Competency to stand trial is a legal concept that asks whether a defendant understands the charges against them and can assist in their own defense. It's different from an insanity defense, which deals with mental state at the time of the crime. Multiple experts evaluated Rebekah. Their conclusions were consistent. She was not competent to stand trial. Her mental illness was so severe that she couldn't meaningfully participate in legal proceedings against her. She couldn't understand the charges, couldn't work with her attorneys, couldn't grasp what was happening. In 2023, the court officially found Rebekah Gasperino not competent to stand trial. She was committed to the Oregon State Hospital, where she would receive psychiatric treatment with the goal of restoring her competency. If and when doctors determined that she was competent, she would be returned to court to face the charges against her. This outcome left many people frustrated. Sophia was still dead. Rebekah was still responsible. But there would be no trial, no jury, no conviction, no sentence, at least not yet. Instead, Rebekah was in a psychiatric hospital, receiving treatment while Sophia's case remained in legal limbo. It's a situation that highlights the challenges of the justice system when dealing with defendants who are severely mentally ill. On one hand, we recognize that punishing someone who can't understand what's happening to them doesn't serve justice. On the other hand, a child is dead, and there's no resolution, no closure, no accountability in the traditional sense. Sophia's family has had to grapple with this reality. They've lost a child, and the person responsible is in a hospital rather than a prison. They can't attend a trial, can't hear a conviction read aloud, can't witness the formal acknowledgement that their loved one was murdered. Instead, they wait, wondering if Rebekah will ever be competent enough to face trial, knowing that even if she is, the legal process will be starting from the beginning. The case raises questions about how we handle parents with severe mental illness and addiction. Rebekah Gasperino was clearly struggling before Sophia's death. Were there warning signs that were missed? Were there interventions that could have been made? Could Child Protective Services have stepped in and removed Sophia from a dangerous situation? These questions are especially pointed because this was not Rebekah's first encounter with the system. She had a documented history of substance abuse and mental health issues. Social services were aware of her situation. Yet Sophia remained in her care until it was too late. This isn't to say that children should be removed from their mothers at the first sign of mental illness or addiction. Family preservation is an important value, and many parents successfully navigate mental health challenges while raising healthy, happy children. The question is, where's the line? At what point do we say that a parent's issues are severe enough that the child is no longer safe? It's an impossible question to answer with any certainty. Every case is different. Every family is different. The risk assessment is always imperfect, always made with incomplete information. But the outcome in Sophia's case suggests that the system failed. A 3-year-old died because the adults responsible for her protection, both her mother and the social services system, didn't keep her safe. Albany held a small memorial service for Sophia. Community members who never knew her came to mourn, to light candles, to acknowledge that a child's life mattered. A local park dedicated a bench in her memory, a place where people can sit and remember that Sophia existed, that she was loved, that her brief life had value. But memorials don't bring children back. They're cold comfort to the family members who actually knew Sophia, who held her, who loved her, who now face a lifetime of grief and unanswered questions. Rebekah remains at the Oregon State Hospital. Progress reports on her treatment are confidential, protected by medical privacy laws. It's unknown whether she's responding to treatment, whether her mental state is improving, whether she's anywhere close to being competent to stand trial. It's possible that she'll never reach competency. Some mental illnesses are so severe, so resistant to treatment, that patients never fully recover. If that's the case with Rebekah, she could remain in the hospital indefinitely, never facing trial for Sophia's death. She would be confined, but she would never be formally convicted, never receive a sentence in the traditional sense. This possibility feels wrong to many people. It seems like Rebekah would be escaping justice, avoiding accountability for her actions. But the reality is more complicated. Being confined to a psychiatric hospital isn't freedom. It's not a pleasant existence. Rebekah is locked up, receiving treatment for serious mental illness, separated from society. In a practical sense, she's serving a sentence even if there's been no conviction. But it's not the same as a murder trial and a prison sentence. It doesn't provide the same sense of justice, the same formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And for Sophia's family, that matters. The case also highlights the intersection of substance abuse, mental illness, and child welfare. These issues are often connected. Parents struggling with addiction frequently also have mental health issues. And when both are present, the risk to children increases dramatically. We need better systems for identifying and helping these families. We need more resources for addiction treatment and mental health care. We need child protective services to have the tools and staff to properly assess risk. We need courts to be able to intervene before tragedy strikes. But we also need to respect family autonomy, avoid removing children unnecessarily, support parents who are trying to get better. It's a delicate balance, and we don't always get it right. In Sophia's case, we got it tragically wrong. A 3-year-old died, and we can't bring her back. We can only learn from what happened, try to do better for the next child at risk, work to prevent future tragedies. Sophia would be 5 years old now if she had lived. She'd be in kindergarten, learning to read, making friends, discovering the world. Instead, she's frozen in time at 3 years old, her potential unrealized, her future stolen. Her story deserves to be remembered, not just as a case number, not just as a legal proceeding in limbo, but as the life of a real child who mattered, who was loved, who should still be here. Complex cases like this remind us how mental health, addiction, and child safety intersect. If you're committed to understanding these difficult issues, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscription helps us continue this important work. Hit that subscribe button now. Case 10, Jessica Marie Smith. Date of crime, August 1st, 2014. Location, Cannon Beach, Oregon. We conclude our journey through Oregon's darkest maternal crimes with a case that encapsulates many of the themes we've explored. A family vacation that became a nightmare, a mother's descent into violence, and the survival of one child who witnessed the unthinkable. Cannon Beach is one of Oregon's most beautiful coastal towns. Famous for Haystack Rock, a massive sea stack that rises 235 feet from the beach, Cannon Beach draws tourists from around the world. Families come to walk the sand, explore tide pools, watch sunsets over the Pacific. It's supposed to be a place of joy, of recreation, of memory-making. But in August of 2014, the surf sand resort in Cannon Beach became the site of a mother's ultimate betrayal. Jessica Marie Smith had come to Cannon Beach with her 2 daughters, 13-year-old Emily and 2-year-old Isabella. Emily's name has been changed in many reports to protect her privacy, but we'll use Emily here. The family was on vacation, ostensibly taking time to relax and bond. But Jessica had brought them to Cannon Beach for a darker purpose. On the evening of August 1st, Jessica took her daughters to their hotel room at the surf sand resort. What happened next was captured in part by hotel surveillance cameras and pieced together by investigators from evidence at the scene and Emily's testimony. Jessica filled the bathtub with water. Then she put 2-year-old Isabella in the tub and held her under the water until the toddler drowned. Emily, the 13-year-old, witnessed her mother murdering her baby sister. The teenager's screams and pleas went unheeded. Jessica was focused on her terrible task, determined to see it through. When Isabella was dead, Jessica turned her attention to Emily. She attempted to drown the 13-year-old as well, forcing her into the bathtub, trying to hold her under the water. But Emily was bigger, stronger, and fighting for her life. She struggled against her mother, managed to break free, and ran from the room screaming for help. Hotel staff responded to Emily's cries. They found the teenager hysterical, injured, telling an impossible story about her mother drowning her sister. They called 911 immediately. Police and paramedics arrived at the surf sand resort within minutes. They found Isabella's body in the bathtub, already gone. They found Jessica Smith in the room, incoherent and unresponsive. And they found Emily, traumatized and terrified, having just watched her mother murder her sister and attempt to murder her as well. Jessica was arrested at the scene. She was charged with aggravated murder for Isabella's death and attempted aggravated murder for the attack on Emily. The charges carried life sentences, if convicted. As the investigation unfolded, a picture emerged of a woman in severe mental crisis. Jessica had a history of depression and anxiety. Friends and family reported that she'd been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the trip to Cannon Beach. She'd made concerning statements, had seemed disconnected from reality, had worried people close to her. But no one expected this. No one thought Jessica would actually harm her children. The prosecution argued that Jessica's actions showed premeditation. She'd driven her daughters to a remote location, away from their normal support systems. She'd chosen a hotel room where they would be isolated. She'd filled a bathtub and systematically drowned one child while attempting to kill the other. These weren't the actions of someone in a brief moment of psychosis. This was planned. The defense countered that Jessica was suffering from severe mental illness, possibly including postpartum depression that had never been properly treated after Isabella's birth 2 years earlier. They argued that she was psychotic, that she believed she was protecting her daughters from something worse, that she wasn't in control of her actions. It was similar to arguments made in other cases we've examined in this documentary. And like those cases, it raised difficult questions about where we draw the line between mental illness and criminal culpability. The trial was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Emily had to testify about what she'd witnessed, describing in horrific detail how her mother had drowned her sister and then tried to drown her. The teenager's testimony was clear, specific, and utterly heartbreaking. She described Isabella's struggles in the bathtub, the toddler's cries, and then silence. She described her mother's face, blank and determined, focused on killing. She described fighting for her own life, the terror of being held underwater by the person who was supposed to protect her. Medical examiners testified about Isabella's death, confirming that she drowned. They noted that drowning is not instantaneous, that it takes several minutes, that the person drowning is conscious and terrified for much of that time. Isabella would have known she was dying, would have struggled, would have experienced unimaginable fear. The jury heard all of this evidence and deliberated on Jessica's fate. They rejected the insanity defense, finding that Jessica had understood what she was doing and had made deliberate choices. In 2016, they convicted her on all counts. The judge sentenced Jessica Marie Smith to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. By the time she's eligible for parole, she'll be in her 60s. Isabella will still be dead. Emily will still carry the scars of what she witnessed. 40 years is a long time. But is it long enough for drowning a 2-year-old and attempting to murder a 13-year-old? That's a question each person has to answer for themselves. Emily survived, but her survival came at an enormous cost. She lost her sister. She lost her mother, not to death but to prison and betrayal. She watched the person she trusted most in the world commit murder. She nearly died herself. How do you recover from that? How do you build a life when your foundation has been shattered so completely? Emily was placed with family members who love her and are committed to her healing. She's received extensive therapy, working to process the trauma of what happened at the surf sand resort. Reports suggest she's doing as well as can be expected, which is to say she's surviving, coping, finding ways to move forward. But she'll carry this with her forever. The memory of that night will never fully fade. The loss of Isabella will ache for the rest of her life. The betrayal by her mother will color every relationship, every trust decision, every moment when she has to be vulnerable with another person. Cannon Beach has tried to move past the tragedy, but it remains a dark chapter in the town's history. The surf sand resort is still in operation, still welcomes families looking for beach vacations. Most guests don't know what happened there in August of 2014, but the staff remembers, the local police remember, and the community remembers. Isabella's death sparked conversations about maternal mental health, about postpartum depression, about the warning signs that someone might be a danger to their children. Jessica had shown signs of deteriorating mental health. Could someone have intervened? Could Isabella's death have been prevented? These questions haunt everyone who knew the family. Friends replay conversations, looking for moments where they should have said something, should have done something. Family members question whether they should have been more insistent that Jessica get help. Doctors wonder if they missed signs during Jessica's medical appointments. But the truth is, predicting violence is incredibly difficult. Most people with mental illness never hurt anyone. Most parents struggling with depression don't harm their children. The vast majority of people who show warning signs never act on them. So how do we know which people will? How do we intervene effectively without overreacting to every person who's struggling? These are questions that mental health professionals, law enforcement, and society as a whole continue to grapple with. What's clear is that Isabella Maples Smith deserved better. She deserved a mother who was healthy and stable. She deserved to grow up, to experience childhood, to become whoever she was meant to be. Instead, her life ended at 2 years old in a bathtub at a beach resort, drowned by the woman who gave her life. Jessica Marie Smith sits in Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, the same prison where Angela McAnulty is housed. She'll remain there until at least 2056, when she becomes eligible for parole. Whether she'll actually be granted parole at that time is anyone's guess. Parole boards take many factors into account, including the nature of the crime, the prisoner's behavior while incarcerated, and the risk to public safety if released. Given that Jessica murdered a child and attempted to murder another, it's likely that she'll face significant opposition to parole when the time comes. Isabella's family will have the opportunity to speak at parole hearings, to remind the board of what was taken, to argue against Jessica's release. Emily will be in her 50s by the time her mother is eligible for parole. She'll have lived more of her life without her mother than with her. She'll have built her own life, possibly have children of her own. And then she'll have to decide whether to attend parole hearings, whether to face the woman who murdered her sister and try to murder her. These are impossible choices that no one should have to make. But Emily will have to make them, because of what her mother did on August 1, 2014. The case of Jessica Marie Smith brings us full circle in our examination of Oregon's most evil mothers. We've seen different motivations, different methods, different outcomes. We've seen mothers who killed for love, mothers who killed from rage, mothers who killed from mental illness, mothers who killed from recklessness. But the common thread is betrayal. Every one of these mothers betrayed the most fundamental trust that exists in human society, the trust between mother and child. They violated the bond that's supposed to be sacred, unbreakable, protective above all else. And in doing so, they didn't just destroy individual lives. They shook entire communities. They forced us all to confront the uncomfortable reality that mothers can be monsters, that the people who give life can also take it away, that trust can be lethal. We've reached the end of our investigation into Oregon's darkest maternal crimes. If this documentary has impacted you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. We bring you the deep dives that matter. Click that subscribe button and help us continue this important work. 10 cases, 10 mothers, 28 victims, most of them children. This is a tragic chapter in Oregon's history, one marked by loss, broken trust, and lives forever changed. We began this journey by asking how love could become harm, how protection could fail. We examined cases spanning more than 6 decades, from Jeannace Freeman in 1961 to Angelina Minor in 2024. These stories involve jealousy, control, untreated mental health struggles, recklessness, and choices that led to irreversible consequences. What can we learn from these difficult stories? First, harm does not always look the way we expect. Some of the individuals involved appeared ordinary to those around them. These cases remind us that warning signs can be subtle and that vigilance matters. Second, mental illness can be a factor, but it is not a justification. Some of the women discussed experienced serious psychological struggles. Understanding that context helps explain how events unfolded, but it does not undo the harm caused. The children affected by these cases, and the survivors, carry lasting trauma. Third, systems sometimes fail. In several of these cases, warning signs were missed. Support systems were inadequate. Resources for struggling families were limited or inaccessible. These failures are not abstract. They impact real children and real communities. Fourth, communities matter. Teachers, neighbors, family members, and friends all play a role in child safety. When concerns are overlooked or dismissed, the consequences can be devastating. Protecting children is a shared responsibility. Most importantly, we honor the victims, not as case files, but as children who mattered. They had personalities, dreams, laughter, and futures that should have been protected. We also recognize the survivors, those who endured unimaginable trauma and continue to rebuild their lives. Their strength reminds us that resilience is real. Healing is possible. Survival is powerful. Oregon has witnessed heartbreaking betrayals of trust, but it has also seen accountability. The justice system, imperfect as it may be, has taken action in these cases. Communities have supported survivors. Awareness has grown. The purpose of telling these stories is not sensationalism. It is remembrance. It is awareness. It is prevention. If you or someone you know is struggling with overwhelming thoughts, depression, or harmful impulses, please seek professional help immediately. Early intervention can save lives. Child protective services, mental health professionals, and crisis hotlines exist to provide support before tragedy happens. This has been Cold Case Hour's investigation into some of Oregon's most disturbing maternal crime cases. These stories are heavy, but remembering the victims matters. Learning from the past matters. Protecting children matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for honoring these lives by listening carefully and thoughtfully. If this investigation was meaningful to you, consider liking this video and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. We are committed to responsible storytelling, shining light on difficult cases while prioritizing respect for victims and their families. Until next time, remember, justice matters, awareness matters, protection matters, and hope always matters.